Hey everyone, do you like going to the movies? Do you like being scared? Well, what if I told you there's a way you can combine both? Yep, that's right, it's time to talk about horror movies. Before we get this video started, let's do the usual thing of remembering to subscribe and hit that like button. Also, check out my channel at dansden.net. Anyway, let's buckle up, because you're in for a scare. I think? Playing on a combination of people's fears, essentially being day-night for the younger generations, and just general aesthetics and getting a house boredom, horror remains one of the biggest draws to the movies right now. Even as action blockbuster franchises dominate the screens, films like Megan and the recent Evil Dead Rise have served up strong numbers on efficiently cheap budgets. Since young people are naturally the type of crowd the movie companies generally want to appeal to the most, this means that horror will continue to remain a very, very lucrative brand for most of Hollywood. Now, not every horror movie is good or even actually all that successful, but it's an actual formulaic way of conjuring, I didn't mean to say that reference, up some cheap, quick thrills and scares. It's been very effective over the years. Horror has existed since the early days of cinema, but the way horror movies used to be released was much different, as wide theatrical openers were not necessarily a thing until the 1970s. This meant that early on horror movies could be released at any particular time period. This isn't to say it still doesn't happen, of course. The Conjuring non-spin-off movies, for example, are always scheduled for release in the summer. However, if there's one month that horror is strongly associated with, that is the formerly barren wasteland known as January. Owing to the fact that the schedule for January used to be relatively slim until recently, largely being Oscar expansions and the dumpiest of dump jobs, studios have for years now taken advantage of the often neglected month by releasing the most standard spook fests they can think of. Every single horror film that has been released in January has debuted in the top 5. Even if they're not doing spectacular business or even getting good reviews, enough people are still lining up and using their hard-earned cash. While studios have obviously released horror movies in January before, that's not what we're here to talk about. This is about the recent-ish phenomenon of releasing scary movies at a specific point in the year, again and again. This trend has been going on for over 15 years now, and outside of a pandemic-induced year, has not slowed down one bit. This only begs the question, how did it begin? The actual proper trend for releasing horror movies at the end of January should largely be credited to the release of the 2005 film White Noise. No, not that White Noise. White Noise is a film from director Jeffrey Sachs and starring Michael Keaton. This little movie, produced largely on a budget of $10 million, was made somewhat outside of the regular studio system, playing on a marketing campaign that emphasized the spookiness of the main character's use of an EVP, or an electric voice phenomenon. This movie became an unexpected hit, beating industry tracking numbers, and it wound up making a tidy profit. The money that White Noise made was significant. See, part of the appeal of horror, especially from a studio head perspective, isn't just because of the scare factor. It's because these movies are made largely on the cheap. As a result, horror can often be just as profitable, if not more profitable, than regular big Hollywood blockbusters. This is why so many notable filmmakers have started their careers out in the genre and then graduated to bigger things. It economically makes perfect sense. Just cast a few actors, have them set in a limited environment, and watch the fireworks go off as they find themselves up against some kind of evil. It's an effective sale, and it's part of horror's longevity in general. In theory, White Noise success seems implausible on paper. I mean, it was a poorly reviewed film, starring an actor who was in a serious career lull at the time, and released at a point when nobody should care about going to the movies. However, White Noise financial fortunes can really be laid in the hands of a crafty studio scheduling decision that may have happened almost entirely by chance. History lesson here, but film companies used to sit out their major releases the first weekend of January. Post-Christmas generally meant that people either wouldn't be going to the movies, or if they did, it was only for the big Christmas release of the prior weekend. Naturally, studios felt it wasn't worth the effort. Prior to White Noise, horror movies tended to be released either at Halloween or any random date, be it the summer or autumn. Heck, they used to release scareums during the holiday seasons. Scream and its sequel Scream 2 were Christmas movies, which sounds kind of insane in retrospect. However, with White Noise, suddenly studios realized they stumbled upon a perfect marketing and release strategy. The first weekend in January used to be a non-starter for people, we had this little horror movie, White Noise, that did business, and that has become a place where movies like that tend to operate. Since then, there's been a glut of horror movies released in January, capitalizing the fact that there's generally very few noteworthy features released for the teenage and young adult demographics around this particular time period. Universal realized, perhaps almost entirely by accident, that they could find success by feeding their appetites. Studios were subsequently going to take their lead. So, with White Noise success, came a barrel of horror movies, released in the early seasons. Let us begin, shall we? 2006 begot Hostel. 2007 gave us The Hitcher. 2008 One Missed Call. 2009 delivered The Unborn. 2010 sucked up Daybreakers. 2011 Season of the Witch. 2012 cursed us with the devil inside. 2013 Texas Chainsaw 3D. 2014 Paranormal Activity The Marked Ones. 2015 The Woman in Black Angel of Death. 2016 The Forest. 2017 The Bye Bye Man. 2018 Insidious The Last Key. 2019 Escape Room. 2020 The Grudge. 2021 didn't have any horror movies because the pandemic truly screwed things over. 2022 Scream, and most recently 2023 Megan. Oh, that was a mouthful. Want me to do it again? On and on and on. Like a marching squad, these movies come year after year after year, and moviegoers by and large eat them up. There was a clear trend that began to form over time. If you want your low-budget, no-brand horror movie to have the best possible level of success, schedule it in January, where unexpected customers, largely young adults, don't have much going on, and thus have no idea what they're getting themselves into, good or bad. So these movies were able to sneak in, get some people to buy tickets, and then they promptly disappeared from our collective memories. Now, these horror movies have a lot in common. They're fast, they're cheap, and they're generally not very good, but they're ultimately very profitable. That's why they were initially scheduled for January, because the money men at the top knew that the products weren't very good, and they figured they could choke up some dollars at the theaters. Investing in any of these films could be a massive boon to one's own career. In recent years, though, as the horror movie in January became more of a clear staple, and something the studios realized had profit potential, variety started to take shape, which led to the quality blooming somewhat in the process. However, even with this improved quality attempt, or at least pushing the experimental nature of horror, still came the massive turkeys. So while some of them, like Escape Room and Megan, do in fact manage to overcome their subpar trappings and become actual solid horror entertainment, that doesn't take away from the overall issue of quality. As far as the majority is concerned, most of the films in the genre, and more specifically, the ones that get released in January, fall more squarely into the abysmal or weak territory. Improvement is one thing, consistency is the real issue. In my mind, the best horror movies are ones that have incredibly killer atmosphere, and they build up more gradually to the threat on screen, before exploding at the end. Take that away, add some silly jump scares, and you have what I would describe as being the majority of these January releases. Movies like The Devil Inside and The Bye Bye Man being huge perpetrators of this. I'm not joking when I say they might be among the worst mainstream studio films I've ever seen, just incredibly unconfident, with some of the laziest attempts at so-called boo scares you're likely to see in a movie in recent years. These movies are largely not good, but they're successful down to a combination of lack of options, and also because horror is an easy sell for a lot of moviegoers. Here's the thing you should know about people. When it comes to movies, they love to be scared. While they're freaked out by things that are unusual, or they don't understand, i.e. supernatural elements, the believability of the possibility of a killer coming right at them with a chainsaw or weapon is just as frightening. While this is all heavily exaggerated in movies, it actually seems like it could plausibly happen. That combined with a salient release date, and you have a recipe for massive, massive success. It's honestly such an obvious thing that I'm surprised that studios didn't think of it earlier, but as is often the case, something had to be the trendsetter first. So say even though a movie like Devil Inside is widely regarded as the absolute bottom of the barrel, down to some very misleading marketing that played up on the movie's supposed freakish nature, teens and 20-something-year-olds flocked in droves. They wanted to see a scary movie, but what they got instead was, well, neither scary nor exciting. This, of course, also brings up the point that if a horror movie opens well and people don't like it, then the thing we can drop in the kindest words possible is going to be brutal. When it comes to this environment, it's either feast or famine. Either you make a good movie that spooks people out, or they're going to respond negatively. Horror is inherently a front-loaded genre, owing to the quality somewhat, but also because it is specifically targeting a particular demographic. But these movies often take that to the extreme. Sounds simple enough, right? If only it was. If making a movie is hard, making a horror movie that everybody universally likes, and within the confines of a January release, is basically the equivalent of impossible. It can be done, but just like about everything, it requires the perfect pitch and execution. The funny thing about all of this, though, is that if these movies had been released in any other particular season, they would likely be flattened by a number of competing pictures. In January, though, the competition is much smaller and or specific. At best, they may be facing a rom-com or a lowbrow comedy, which are going to go for different demographics anyway, and they more often than not come out on top. I think the solidification of January horror movies as a poignant selling point was pretty apparent when that awful One Missed Call remake, that everybody basically swept under the rug a week after it was released, overperformed industry expectations. Not a huge hit, I mean it only debuted at number 5, and it's one of the lower grossing films on this long movie list. However, its opening weekend was basically a miracle. Consider this movie that by every other inkling, basically felt like it was being left to die. Or was it? The scheduling for One Missed Call was actually very likely intentional on Warner Brothers' part, because they knew they had a dud on their hands. I mean, I assume they saw the final product, so they pushed it off to the beginning of January, where they figured that people would be the most interested in it. Release the movie in, say, June, where new releases are higher, and it gets lost in the shuffle, but the beginning of the year is perfect for this kind of low-quality, low-conceived film. Genius, or just a sign of desperation? More like common sense. Scheduling is hard. Sometimes intentional, sometimes it's like throwing darts at a wall. With horror, though, producers and executives started to realize the perfect time to release these movies was when there was nothing else going on. And guess what? It turns out they knew what they were talking about. It might have been an accident that started this whole trend, or was it? But for what started out as a way to get some cheap money out of genre trash that people figured was bad, it turned out to be utterly genius. The January horror trend has shown no signs of slowing down anytime soon, with the recent Scream film, and in particular Megan, being huge hits. Later is noteworthy because it was not only well received, but it played up on TikTok trends, proving the genre's salience for young audiences. These movies are generally looked down upon by legit real horror fans, who see them as nothing more than substandard, and I can see why. At best, they're really fun, and at worst, they're nigh impossible to watch, outside of a let's get together and make fun of this movie group type situation. For many average moviegoers, though, they represent, at least on paper, the sort of late night fear factor they want to experience when they go to a theater. Just watching a feature film where a bunch of people get chased down by a crazy maniac, or one where they encounter an evil doll. All of this with a crowd that is startled by every jump scare. It's a selling point that's as old as time itself.